le 8 juillet 1944. Just outside Le Désert, Normandy, morning fog clung low over the hedgerows, thick and still, like a blanket pulled tight over a battlefield not yet finished with its dead. Sergeant Curtis Culin crouched near a mossy ridge of tangled roots and soil, listening. A Sherman tank growled behind him, its engine strained, gears grinding as it crawled toward the next hedgerow wall. They'd done this a dozen times. The playbook never changed. The tank inched forward, climbed the earthen embankment like a turtle trying to scale a log, exposed its belly, and crack. A dull thud, followed by fire. The Sherman rocked violently. Flames shot out from the driver's hatch like a blowtorch. The turret didn't turn. No one bailed out. Cullen closed his eyes for half a second. Another crew gone. Hit from the left again. Someone muttered behind him. Maybe a gunner. Maybe just another scared kid trying to sound calm. They wait till we crest, then punch us right through. That was the problem. Normandy's hedgerows, those ancient walls of stone, earth, and dense vegetation, weren't just farm fences. They were fortresses. Built centuries ago to mark property lines, now turned into perfect ambush sites. The Germans had the high ground, cover, and patience. American tanks had doctrine, and doctrine was getting men killed. The manual said tanks should climb over. Command said tanks should climb over. Even the engineers said tanks should climb over. And every time they did, another Sherman exposed its soft underbelly directly in line with German anti-tank weapons. The enemy didn't need to chase them. They just waited. Culin stood slowly, scanning the wreckage. The tank was gone, reduced to a smoldering carcass of warped steel and black smoke. One wheel spun lazily in the air, still trying to turn. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The other men nearby, tankers, welders, mechanics, had seen enough. Behind the tree line sat a pile of twisted metal, rusting in silence. Jagged crossbeams, bent iron, fragments of German Czech hedgehogs, the beach obstacles meant to destroy landing craft during D-Day. The engineers called them junk, scrap, worthless, after the beachhead was taken. But Culin didn't see junk. He saw teeth. "Get me a torch," he said, pointing to the pile. "And bring that chunk with the three-point star pattern." A corporal raised an eyebrow. "You want us to weld beach obstacles to a Sherman?" "No," Culin replied. "I want to stop burying friends every 200 yards. I think we can turn that garbage into something useful." The team moved fast. They dragged steel beams into the maintenance bay, sparks flying as they cut crude angles, and drove bolts through the front plate of one of the tanks. What emerged a few hours later looked ridiculous. 4 sharp steel prongs welded like tusks onto the bow of a Sherman. No blueprint, no authorization, just Cullen's gut and a welder's steady hand. A captain walked by, stopped cold, and stared. "What the hell is that?" he asked. "A hedgerow cutter," Culin said simply. "We're gonna punch through instead of climbing over." The captain scoffed. "Looks like a cow catcher from a train." "Good," Culin said. "That means it's working already." Hey. By nightfall, Culin's modified Sherman rolled toward the next hedgerow. The sun dipped low as the tank picked up speed, prongs lowered like a battering ram. Instead of climbing, it slammed into the earth wall, slicing straight through. No belly exposure. No pause. No kill zone. They reached the other side in seconds. And for the first time in weeks, no one died. The next morning, before the sun had burned off the fog, 2 more Shermans rolled into the maintenance yard outside Le Désert. Word had spread. Not from headquarters, not through paperwork, but from tank crew to tank crew, the way soldiers always pass along what actually works. "What is that thing?" asked Staff Sergeant Bill Hayes of the 3rd Armored Division, pointing to the pronged Sherman parked under a torn canvas tarp. Curtis Culin stood up from behind a welding rig, sweat already soaking through his undershirt. He wiped his face with a grease-streaked rag and motioned Hayes over. "Come take a look," Culin said. "It's just steel from those beach obstacles, welded to the front plate, cuts right through the base of a hedgerow." Hayes squatted next to the tank, eyes tracing the crude but solid welds. It looked ugly, uneven teeth like a shark with a broken jaw. But there was no mistaking the logic. With enough speed and power, it could break the root structure, and push through like a plow. That actually work? We tried it last night. One push, clean cut, no belly exposed, no crew lost. Hayes stood and turned to his driver. Get ours ready. We're staying here until they weld that onto ours. Within 48 hours, 5 more tanks arrived for modification. Then 10, then entire platoons. Welding stations ran around the clock. Exhausted mechanics worked by lantern light, cutting and grinding captured German steel scrap, designed to stop tanks on beaches now repurposed to save them in fields. And still, no orders from high command. This wasn't coming from the top, it was coming from the bottom. One field innovation passed hand to hand, from crew to crew, like an underground railroad of survival. The men weren't asking permission anymore. They didn't need to. What they needed was a way to stay alive. Across the Hedgerow country, Shermans began sporting strange metal prongs, some with clean welds, others bolted in place with whatever parts were on hand. Some looked like tuning forks, others like jagged teeth. It didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that it worked. And it did. Reports started coming back from the field. In places where tanks once crawled and died, they were now breaking through. Infantry followed close behind, using the paths cut by the pronged Shermans to assault German positions from angles the enemy never expected. The entire battlefield rhythm began to change. For weeks, the Americans had been stuck bogged down in the deadly, suffocating terrain of bocage country. Now, thanks to scrap metal and a sergeant's hunch, the lines started to move. Not fast, not without cost, but they moved. A lieutenant from the 2nd Armored Division summed it up in a field report that never made it to the front page of any newspaper. Morale is better. Crews are surviving. We owe it to a piece of junk welded to the front of our tanks. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't official. But for the men inside those steel coffins, it was the difference between burning alive and coming home. Back at the motor pool, Culin watched as another tank rolled out with its new teeth. A private tossed him a ration tin filled with screws, washers, and half-melted metal chunks. More German trash, he said with a grin. Culin caught it, shook it like dice, and nodded. Perfect. We're not just fighting the war anymore. We're outsmarting it. The 11th of July, 1944. Just outside St. Lo. The air reeked of churned mud, diesel smoke, and wet vegetation. Normandy's infamous hedgerows were thicker here, walls of earth and tangled roots taller than a man and deeper than a ditch. The roads were narrow, often mined, and every open field meant a chance for a German 88mm to find its mark. American infantry crouched low in ditches, their rifles cradled like lifelines, waiting for the signal to move. Behind them, the tanks came. Shermans with crude prongs welded to their hulls lined up like cattle at a gate. Some had perfectly symmetrical teeth, cut from salvaged Czech hedgehogs. Others were slapped together with spare track links, steel fence posts, even parts of destroyed German guns. None of them looked like they belonged in a military blueprint. But every tanker who had seen one in action knew exactly what they were. Hedgerow cutters. The order came down. Move on the hedgerow line, 3 tanks abreast, infantry behind. This was supposed to be another bloodbath. The Germans had held this sector for days, sniping from hidden pockets, firing Panzerfausts from behind dense walls of green. They expected the same American mistake tanks crawling over the ridge, belly up and exposed. But this time, the Shermans didn't climb. They slammed. With throttles wide open, the lead tanks rammed the base of the hedgerow wall. The prongs dug into the tangle of soil, roots, and rock, and split it like firewood. Dirt flew in every direction. The entire section of embankment burst open in front of them, and the tank rolled through like it was nothing more than a muddy bump. Seconds later, the next Sherman followed, then the next. Infantry poured in behind the breach, flanking the stunned German defenders, who had positioned themselves to fire upward, not sideways. The first German position fell in minutes, 2 more within the hour. By nightfall, the Americans had taken 600 yards of hedgerow country, a stretch they had failed to seize for over a week. That night, around a small fire behind a shattered farmhouse, tank commanders and infantry sergeants met. Maps were unrolled on a makeshift table, actually the door of a burned-out French truck, and the officers traced the next hedgerow lines. How many tanks got hit today? One asked. 2. Crews survived. Both had cutters. Huh. What about the ones that didn't? The room went quiet. 3 tanks knocked out. All climbers. 2 total losses. No one had to say it. The numbers spoke for themselves. The cutters weren't just useful, they were saving lives. Dozens each day. Maybe more. A radio operator handed off a field update to a nearby lieutenant. He skimmed it, then handed it to Culin, who was hunched over a map, circling sectors for the next morning's push. 3rd Armored wants specs, the lieutenant said. They want to copy your design and pass it up the chain. Culin looked up. We don't have specs. Then give them something. They're asking if this thing's got a name. Culin thought for a second. Then he shrugged. Call it whatever you want, he said. We just weld, drive, and hope it holds. Eventually, someone settled on a name. The Rhino device. It stuck. Before long, division engineers were sketching formal blueprints based on what Culin and his crew had already figured out in the field. But even then, most crews didn't wait. They kept welding whatever they had. No 2 Rhino cutters looked the same. Some were elegant, others barely held together. But they worked. And soon, hundreds of Shermans across 1st Army rolled into combat with jagged steel mouths gnashing their way through hedgerows that had once swallowed tanks whole. By mid-July, American units were breaking through terrain that had stalled them for weeks. Entire battalions advanced faster. Infantry losses dropped, and tank survival rates improved dramatically. And still, no medals, no ceremonies. Just another day in the field, another mile forward, another crew that made it out alive because someone had the guts to cut steel and break the rules. Curtis Culin didn't care. Neither did the men around him. All they wanted was to live long enough to fight another day. And now, thanks to scrap metal and battlefield instinct, they could. WWII 1944. Near Pont Hebert, Normandy. The battlefield looked different now. Where once tanks had moved cautiously, crawling over hedgerows and daring fate, they now struck with momentum. Infantry officers noticed it first. The pace of the advance was no longer dictated by terrain. It was dictated by will. American forces were beginning to break out of the static maze of Norman farmland, and it wasn't because of a new weapon or secret order. It was because of a few steel prongs welded by hand. At the headquarters of Zeven Corps, Colonel Eugene Landrum stood over a wall-sized map marked with unit movements. His aide entered, holding a typed field report. Sir, another battalion with those improvised hedgerow cutters broke through 5 miles in less than 36 hours. Landrum barely looked up. That's Culin's modification? Yes, sir. They're calling them rhinos now. Infantry says they're saving lives. Tanks are lasting longer. Landrum sighed, rubbing his temples. He'd been skeptical. Field improvisation often caused more problems than it solved. Weld a wrong piece of metal to a tank's front end, and it could destabilize the chassis or overheat the engine. But the data was clear. Units using the Rhino device had lower casualty rates and fewer vehicle losses. Send a request up the chain, he said. Let ordnance know. If this works, we'll need it standardized. It was the first time anything official was put in writing. Meanwhile, the men in the field didn't wait for approval. In the motor pools and field depots, sparks flew all day and into the night. Cutting torches hissed, steel clanged, and tank crews stood in line waiting their turn. 3 more tanks need cutters before morning, a corporal yelled across the yard. A sergeant welding the frame of a Rhino device didn't even look up. They'll get 'em. Might be ugly, but they'll punch through. Some tanks had elegantly shaped prongs, cut with precision. Others had irregular beams bolted at odd angles. But beauty didn't matter. Results did. Private Jimmy Lutz, a loader in the 2nd Armored, looked at the new attachment on his tank and muttered, "Hell of a nose job." His driver laughed, "Better than a nosebleed." The morale shift was subtle but real. Crews started painting teeth on the cutters, shark mouths, tusks, slogans. What started as a desperate fix became a badge of pride. These weren't just tanks anymore. They were bruisers, gate crashers, Rhino Shermans. More reports filtered in. Units with Rhino tanks had nearly doubled the rate of Hedgerow breakthroughs compared to those without. Some platoons claimed they hadn't lost a single tank since switching over. The numbers weren't inflated, they were consistent. And lives were being saved. Tankers began to estimate it aloud. 2 guys here. 5 there. Maybe 10 more last week. All still breathing because of that hunk of German steel welded to our front. Sergeant Culin, still stationed near the front, received an informal visit from an Army engineer sent from Corps Command. The officer, clipboard in hand, looked over the tanks and the crew working the welders. "These modifications aren't regulation," he said flatly. Culin didn't stop working. "They're not supposed to be. Some concern at command about weight distribution might affect handling. They handle better than coffins." The officer didn't argue. He just took notes. As Operation Cobra loomed, General Bradley's breakout push from Normandy units across the 1st and 3rd Armies were quietly, unofficially, modifying their tanks. By the time the first orders from command formally authorized Rhino kits, nearly 60% of the frontline Shermans already had them. The Army was playing catch-up with its own soldiers. And at the center of it all stood a soft-spoken, practical New Jersey sergeant who had seen a tank burn, picked up a piece of beach trash, and decided he'd had enough. Culin never gave speeches. He never asked for recognition. But every time a Rhino tank punched through a hedgerow and came out the other side intact, his work spoke loud and clear. He didn't redesign the Sherman. He just made sure more men lived long enough to finish the fight. The 25th of July, 1944. Just before dawn, American artillery lit the sky over St. Lo like a rolling thunderstorm. For hours, more than 1,500 bombers, fighters, and heavy guns pounded German lines along a narrow front. Trees shattered, trenches vanished. And when the smoke cleared, the field south of St. Lo looked like the surface of the moon. But the hedgerows still stood. Even after the bombardment, those earthen walls, dense with roots and reinforced over generations, remained. Blasted, scorched, but not broken. They were too thick, too ancient, too stubborn to die in one strike. That's when the tanks moved. Rhino Shermans, dozens of them, fanned out across the line. Their steel prongs, some clean-cut, others rust-colored and jagged, pointed forward like lances. Engines revved. Infantry crouched low behind them, waiting. "Punch through and don't stop," came the order over the radio. The lead tanks surged forward. No hesitation, no climbing. They hit the first hedgerows head-on. The cutters dug in like blades through damp bread. Entire sections of hedgerow split open in a roar of dirt, roots, and broken stone. Shermans crashed through, suspensions groaning, guns swiveling to cover the flanks. Dust coated their hulls, but they didn't stop. The Germans weren't ready for this. In every previous encounter, they had waited for the American tanks to crawl up the hedgerows, exposing their soft underbellies. This time, the Shermans didn't climb, they burst straight through, staying low, keeping their frontal armor toward the fight. One Panther crew in a camouflage slit trench opened fire too late. The Rhino Sherman was already inside the tree line. One shot, one kill. The Panther burned. Its crew never made it out. In sector after sector, the Rhino tanks led the charge, splitting the ancient defenses in half, dragging infantry behind them like a plow pulling a new path through the battlefield. Entire German formations were caught off guard, fired too high, too slow, or from the wrong angle. In less than 72 hours, the 1st U.S. Army pushed over 7 miles south, further than in the previous 3 weeks combined. Sherman crews, many of whom had survived the worst of Normandy's brutal hedgerow trap, finally saw open country ahead. Fields, roads, the kind of terrain their tanks were designed to dominate. It felt like escaping a cage. And the Rhino device, welded from beach trash and desperation, was at the center of that breakout. In one radio dispatch, a company commander from the 30th Infantry Division put it bluntly, "We owe our advance to 2 things, air support and these damn farm plow tanks." General Omar Bradley himself took notice. Touring forward positions 2 days after Cobra's launch, he stepped beside a Sherman caked in mud, its Rhino teeth bent and chipped from repeated charges. He tapped the steel with his cane. "This looks unofficial," Bradley said with a faint grin. The tank commander, His helmet dusted white with powdered earth, just smiled back. "Sir, it's working." Bradley didn't argue. Soon after, official orders came down for mass production of Rhino kits. Factory-made versions were developed and distributed through ordnance depots, meant to standardize what the tankers had already built in the field. But for many on the front lines, the factory versions came too late. They already had what they needed because they built it themselves. By early August, Rhino-equipped Shermans were used across multiple divisions, from the 2nd Armored to the 4th Infantry. Some crews added upgrades, sharper teeth, wider spacing, even chains or hooks to drag the hedgerow debris clear. It was no longer about surviving. It was about pushing forward faster, deeper, harder. As France opened up, and tanks rolled into broader farmland and villages beyond the bocage, the Rhino devices were slowly removed. The terrain changed, the enemy tactics evolved. But what those cutters did in those brutal, close-knit Norman fields would not be forgotten. Not by the men who made it through, and not by the ones who never got the chance because their tanks came too early, before one man picked up a piece of German scrap and welded it to the front of a Sherman. The 2nd of August, 1944. Somewhere between Coutances and Avranches, Sherman tanks rolled over open farmland, their treads kicking dust into the late summer air. Normandy's claustrophobic hedgerows were now behind them, burned, broken, and split wide by the Rhino. What once seemed like an impenetrable wall had become memory, cut down not by strategy books or field manuals, but by one soldier with no authority to invent anything. Sergeant Curtis Culin wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a designer. He was a tank mechanic and a problem solver. And more than anything, he was tired of watching crews burn. Weeks after Operation Cobra shattered German lines, word of Culin's creation finally made it to the top. Not through bureaucratic channels, but through results. American forces had gone from moving yards per day to miles per hour. And commanders who once ignored field modifications were now asking, how'd they do it? Culin never held a press conference. He never drafted a schematic. He simply told the truth. "I saw what wasn't working," he said, "and I tried something that might." A few days after the breakout, General Bradley's staff called for him. Culin arrived in a dirt-covered uniform, smelling of diesel and welding smoke. He stood in front of a tent near a forward command post, nervously adjusting his helmet strap as two aides reviewed a typewritten report. One of them looked up. "You're the one who started the cutter project?" "Yes, sir." "With beach junk?" "Yes, sir." There was a pause. Then the aide extended a hand. "Headquarters says you saved hundreds of lives, maybe more." Culin didn't know how to respond. He didn't ask for thanks. He just wanted tanks to stop flipping over like tin cans. He wanted crews to come back in one piece. The following week, Culin was awarded the Legion of Merit for his contribution. In the official citation, it read, "For exceptional ingenuity in the field under fire, developing an armor modification that significantly improved combat effectiveness against entrenched enemy positions." But Culin never wore the medal on his jacket. Not in camp. Not in front of his men. When someone asked him why, he simply replied, "I didn't do it alone." And he meant it. Because behind every Rhino device was a chain of hands. The tank commander who let his Sherman be cut into. The mechanic who scavenged German steel from abandoned beaches. The welder who stayed up until midnight, fusing prongs onto scorched hulls. The loader who trusted that this strange-looking tank would get him through the next wall of earth alive. This wasn't a one-man miracle. It was a shared instinct for survival. A network of soldiers who stopped waiting for orders and started building solutions. In the following months, the Army's official engineering teams released blueprints for standardized hedgerow cutters. They came with part numbers, instructions, and diagrams. But in the corner of those documents, there was always a quiet footnote. Based on initial field design, developed by Sergeant C. Culin. He never got rich. He never sought promotion. And by the end of the war, Culin went home like thousands of others, quietly, without ceremony. Yet ask any Sherman crew who punched through the bocage in July of '44 what saved them, and they wouldn't mention tactics or air cover first. They'd mention a few crooked prongs welded to the front of their tank, and the guy with the torch who refused to let another tank die climbing a wall it should have gone through instead. August 1944. Forward maintenance area. Somewhere near Morton. The war had moved on. The bocage was thinning. Towns were falling fast. Vire, Avranches, Le Mesnil. But in the muddy lots behind the lines, where tank treads groaned on greasy rollers and diesel fumes hung like mist, the Rhino cutter was still being built, still passed from one crew to the next, like a secret handshake. There was no official class, no engineering school, no training film, only hands. Rough, grease-blackened hands, learning from the crew next to them. One sergeant would show another how to align the prongs so they didn't interfere with the tank's front sprocket. A private would demonstrate how to cut an old German I-beam at just the right length. Someone else would talk about bolt spacing while chewing on cold cornbread. No manuals, just memory. In some cases, units stripped damaged tanks on the spot. Salvage teams would tear metal from destroyed Panthers or 88mm gun shields. Anything thick and strong enough to punch roots was fair game. Lieutenant Frank Day, 743rd Tank Battalion, wrote in a letter home, "We took half a flak gun mount from a wrecked Jerry truck, welded it to the Sherman. The driver called it his cowcatcher. Cut through 2 hedgerows before breakfast." What started as a desperate fix had become a culture. Crews began naming their tanks again. Root Ripper, Bushwhacker, Daisy Cutter. One painted a cartoon rhino with a cigar on the turret. Another scrawled Culin's Claw in white chalk across the front plate. They weren't following doctrine anymore. They were writing their own. And command, finally, was watching. The 2nd Armored Division established its own rhino welding station. A mobile truck carried spare beams, torches, and cutting gear. Crews were told to bring their tanks in between operations and get the teeth put on. Some battalions scheduled rhino fitting like it was part of maintenance rotation, fuel, oil, prongs. By late August, over 60% of tanks in 1st Army had some version of the device. Even British units began asking questions. "You lot using the cutters?" One British liaison officer asked a U.S. mechanic near Dome Front. "Hell yes," the American replied. "Want the measurements or the steel?" "Both, mate." Even within U.S. forces, variations grew. Engineers tried out hinged cutters that flexed on impact. Others welded U-shaped hooks to drag away debris. None of it was standard, but all of it worked better than waiting for clearance. And beneath it all, the same simple truth remained. The Rhino was saving lives. Sergeant Ron Holloway of the 4th Armored Division estimated his crew broke through nearly 30 hedgerows in the final weeks of July. "Never got caught once," he told an interviewer after the war. "Didn't lose a single man in my tank." We all knew why. It wasn't because their gun was bigger or that their tank was faster. It was because they didn't go over, they went through. And every time that cutter hit dirt, roots cracked, trees shook, and the tank kept rolling. The Germans noticed too. Captured Wehrmacht soldiers questioned by U.S. intelligence spoke of the charging American tanks that didn't pause, didn't climb, didn't give time to aim. Their field defenses, once so effective, had been bypassed by something they didn't expect. A modified farm plow welded onto a Sherman. But for all its effectiveness, the Rhino never became a symbol back home. There were no recruiting posters, no newsreels focused on the device. It was too ugly, too simple, too blue-collar. The kind of fix that made sense in a workshop, not on a parade ground. And that was fine with the men who used it. Because in the thick of war, with sweat in their eyes and steel under their boots, they weren't chasing medals. They were chasing one more mile, one more field, one more chance to bring the whole crew back. And in those fields of Normandy, it was a few crooked beams of salvaged steel that made all the difference. Late August 1944. Normandy was behind them now. The road to Paris had opened. Towns were falling one after another. The bocage, the trap that had stalled entire divisions, was nothing more than a grim memory in the rearview mirror of a dusty convoy. And yet, every tank crew who had survived it still carried the imprint of those hedgerows. The roots, the traps, the dead friends left behind in burning shells that tried to climb instead of cut. In a field hospital near Le Mans, Corporal Henry Miller of the 35th Infantry Division leaned on a crutch and spoke to a war correspondent from Stars and Stripes. His leg was bandaged, wrapped tight from a mine blast. He didn't talk about his wound. He talked about the Rhino. We lost 3 tanks before we got those cutters welded on. Next week, 0 losses. 0. Same terrain, same German teams waiting behind the brush. Only difference was those metal teeth on the front. There were dozens of stories like his. Hundreds, maybe. But no one wrote them down at the time. There was no box on the after-action report that said, "Survived due to unauthorized field modification." It didn't fit in the paperwork. The Army did its best to track success in bigger terms. Territory gained, units advanced, enemy resistance broken. But beneath those figures was a quieter set of numbers crew survival rates that had sharply improved in Rhino-equipped units. A report from the 3rd Armored Division noted a 43% decrease in tank crew fatalities in Hedgerow country after Rhino adoption. Not from better armor, not from tactical miracles, from 4 welded beams. And yet, there was never a clean count of how many lives it saved. Not really. But veterans remembered. They remembered the tanks that didn't come back. They remembered the days before the cutters when every hedge was a guess, and every guess could mean a funeral. And they remembered the moment that changed. Sergeant Robert Red Kinley, who fought through St. Lo and beyond, described it best. "It wasn't that we got braver. We just stopped dying at every bush. That thing on the front, it gave us a chance. Sometimes, that's all you need." In some units, Rhino devices were treated like sacred objects. When a tank was knocked out, the first thing crews tried to salvage after the radio and the machine guns was the cutter. They'd strip it off, weld it onto another tank, and send it back into the line. The steel teeth became heirlooms. Not because of superstition, but because they worked. When official Rhino kits began arriving from the rear depots in August, they were clean, polished, and factory cut. But most crews preferred their originals, the rough ones, the ones built in a hurry with German scrap and sweat and field welding rigs. Because those weren't just tools. They were proof. Proof that someone had looked at a broken system and said, "No more." Proof that even in a war of generals and doctrine, a single mechanic with a torch could change the course of a campaign. Curtis Culin never asked to count lives. He never tried to add it all up. But for every field medic who didn't unzip another body bag, for every tank commander who saw his whole crew climb out after a hit that never came, the impact was clear. And the strange, jagged, ugly hunk of steel welded to the front of a Sherman became something more than an improvised fix. It became the reason someone went home. Early September 1944. Outside Reims, France. The front had moved fast, faster than anyone expected. U.S. forces were closing in on the German border, crossing bridges that hadn't yet been demolished, rolling through villages that once seemed unreachable. For the first time in months, the war felt like it was leaning their way. But in the motor pools, on the back roads, and inside the turrets of muddy Shermans, the story of that success wasn't written in speeches or campaign ribbons. It was welded, crooked, and rusting still bolted to the front plates of the tanks that had clawed their way out of Normandy. Staff Sergeant Walter Kruger, 2nd Armored Division, stood beside his tank during a rare moment of quiet. He ran a cloth along the side of the Rhino prongs, now blunted and nicked from weeks of use. One of the beams had bent backward after crashing into a stone-reinforced hedge. It still held. "That cutter's the reason I'm still standing here," he said to a young replacement fresh from England. "You'll hear a lot about big battles and generals. Just don't forget it was scrap steel that got us through." Up the chain of command, officers and war planners began praising the Rhino in official briefings, though few understood how it came to be. They spoke of field ingenuity, mechanical initiative, and combat adaptation. What they didn't say, at least not openly, was that the Rhino began as something outside the system, a violation of regulations, an unsanctioned experiment, a tank modification made without orders, approval, or design testing. But what Culin and his fellow tankers had done was exactly what combat demands adapt to survive. It was a truth every soldier learned fast. The manual goes out the window the moment the shooting starts. No doctrine had predicted the bocage. No training scenario prepared a crew for fighting through 20 feet of dirt wall reinforced by centuries of roots, and no supply officer had a line item for beach obstacle parts to weld on tanks. That's why the Rhino mattered. Not just for what it did, but for how it happened. It wasn't invented in a lab or drafted at a desk. It was born in the heat of need, built with stolen time and spare parts, passed from man to man because nobody had time to wait. It traveled not by memo but by example. A tank rolled through a hedge. Another crew saw it. They copied it. Then another. Then another. Like fire spreading from one trench to the next. And in that way, it became something rare in war. A bottom-up revolution. General Omar Bradley later acknowledged it in his memoirs, calling the Rhino a brilliant field adaptation that allowed us to break the stalemate in Normandy. He didn't mention Curtis Culin by name. Most generals didn't know him, but the men who followed his lead never forgot. Even as the war rolled east toward the Siegfried Line, into the Ardennes, across the Rhine, the Rhino remained etched in memory. For many, it became the quiet example of what could happen when soldiers on the ground were trusted to figure things out. Years later, in post-war studies of armored warfare, military analysts would refer to the Rhino as one of the most effective tactical innovations of the European campaign, not because it was complex, but because it worked, and because it didn't wait for permission. In those muddy, desperate days after D-Day, the soldiers who grabbed torches and cut steel weren't trying to make history. They were trying to live, and that's why their solution still matters. October 1944. A Sherman from the 5th Armored Division sat quietly in a staging field near Luxembourg, its Rhino teeth still welded firm to the front hull. Rain collected in the weld seams. Rust had begun to creep along the edges. The prongs were dull, now blunted from crashing through dozens of hedgerows, cracked walls, and barricades. But it was still there. Even with the bocage behind them, crews didn't remove the Rhino right away. Some said it brought luck. Others simply didn't want to change the machine that had carried them through the hardest part of the war. By then, everyone in the First Army knew the name Curtis Culin. Not from press briefings or radio broadcasts, but from motor pool word of mouth and after-action chatter. The man who turned German beach junk into a survival tool. The guy who looked at a suicide mission and thought, there's gotta be a better way. Culin, now back from the front lines, had been reassigned to an engineering detachment. His new job was to help standardize field innovations across divisions, but whenever someone asked him about the Rhino, he'd shake his head. It wasn't mine alone, he'd say. I just had the first spark. The rest, that was all of us. And that was the truth. No one welded alone. No one installed those cutters without a team. From grease monkeys to crew chiefs to field welders with no more than a hacksaw and a gut feeling, the Rhino was a collective act of defiance against terrain, against doctrine, against death itself. When the war finally ended, most of the Rhino-equipped tanks were either scrapped or returned to depot yards. The prongs were cut off, the hulls sandblasted. The Army moved on, but Veteran didn't forget. At reunions years later, the talk would always come back to the bocage, not the cities, not the big victories, but those hedgerows in Normandy, the ones that swallowed whole columns of tanks and the ugly piece of steel that turned the tide. One tanker at a 1,954 veterans gathering in Philadelphia put it plainly. They taught us how to shoot, how to march, how to follow orders. But that cutter, that thing taught us how to think. In the decades that followed, the Rhino cutter became a case study in military innovation. West Point cadets were taught the story as an example of battlefield adaptation. Combat engineers studying asymmetric warfare cited it in after-action reviews. And even into the 21st century, the idea lived on through improvised armor in Iraq, mine rollers in Afghanistan, welding rigs on MRAPs in dusty maintenance yards where the manuals still hadn't caught up to reality. It always started the same way. A soldier sees a pattern that kills. Then he finds a way to stop it without asking first. That was the real lesson of the Rhino. It wasn't just a steel prong or a plow welded to a tank. It was proof that in the worst conditions, with the fewest tools, American soldiers could still outthink the battlefield. Curtis Culin passed away in 1963. He never wrote a book, never gave a lecture. His name doesn't sit on a war memorial in Washington, but on a quiet hill in Normandy, where hedgerows still grow thick and untamed. There's a small stone marker placed by veterans of the 2nd Armored Division. It reads, "In honor of those who found a way through." And beneath that, etched into weathered granite, welded by hands that refused to die trying.